Hello, this is UKRLIFE with Lyudmila Nemyrya, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev, and we are very happy that our guest today is General Ben Hodges. General, good morning, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Good morning, Lyudmila, and thank you again for the privilege.
Thank you. General, we are talking in the December 2024. It is the end of the year, and we are near the beginning of the next year. And maybe it's time to make some conclusions and to make some strategic forecast for the next year. Let's start from this year. What do you think? How situation change this year? I mean, starting from the situation on the Ukrainian battlefields to Syrian escalation, from Korean soldiers in Europe to use of intercontinental ballistic missiles. And if I'm not mistaken, it is the first time for the military use of such type of missiles.
Well, of course, Ukraine is in the situation it's in now, and we are in the situation we're in now, in part because the West, specifically the United States and Germany, failed to make it a priority for Ukraine to defeat Russia. We failed to make it our strategic objective for Ukraine to win. Instead, the administration, which did a lot to keep nations together and a lot of support was provided, but it was only done within the context of preventing escalation and not helping Ukraine win. So because of that, we had a long period where no U.S. aid arrived. And then we also have this ridiculous policy that restricted Ukraine from using certain weapons against Russian targets inside Russia. If we had been serious and had the right sense of urgency, and if there had been no restrictions, then I think more countries would have done more, especially Germany, if the United States had done that. And so it's remarkable to me what Ukraine has accomplished. It's clear that Russia cannot defeat Ukraine. It cannot overrun Ukrainian defenders unless we in the West quit. That's how I would say it. It's certainly terrible what happens to Ukrainian civilians in all these cities because we have not helped Ukraine find the capability to attack Russian airfields and other places from which these missile attacks are launched. But I think that what the army has done, it's remarkable. The last thing I'd say on this is Russia's choice to launch this Oreshnik medium range or intermediate range ballistic missile towards Dnipro was intended, or I take two things from that. Number one, this was intended to add to the fear that some people have that Russia might use a nuclear weapon, which I don't believe they are, but that was part of the messaging. But it also told me that they did this in response to Ukraine being able to use ATACMS against targets in and around Kursk. That tells you how much they dread Ukraine having that capability. That capability for Ukraine is so important, so much so that Russia was willing to launch this missile to signal their unhappiness about it. That's motivation for me to continue advocating for Ukraine to have that capability.
General, let's speak a little bit about Russia and Putin. It looks like Putin tried to build a military bloc from Russia, Korea, and Iran, and of course Belarus. How this will affect for the balance of power, not just in Europe, but in Pacific region and on the Middle East?
Well, it's interesting, this axis of evil with Russia and China and North Korea and Iran, plus Russia being able to operate in Africa and, of course, Syria. As I look at the situation, these are countries that, particularly China, as well as Russia. They don't like the current international rules-based order where countries get to make their own choices, this liberal democratic values. They want to change that. But I don't think China and Russia, I don't see them as allies as much as I see China benefiting from cheap Russian oil and gas. I think that Iran has no other friend in the world except for Russia. North Korea has no friend in the world except for Russia. And now we're seeing this week how Syria also has no friends except for Russia. And even Russia looks to be pulling some of its people out of Syria, maybe even its navy, because of what the rebels are accomplishing there. So, given the connection between these countries, it seems to me that our strategy from the West should be Russia first. In other words, help Ukraine defeat Russia. And if you defeat Russia, that leaves Syria, Iran, and North Korea totally isolated and unable to, well, for Iran, for example, its support for Hezbollah and the Houthis and Hamas, its cooperation with Syria, all of these things would be greatly degraded from a strategic approach. This is how you do it, by defeating Russia first. And of course, that would send a powerful message to China that the West has the political will, the industrial capacity, and the military capability to help Ukraine defeat Russia first. I think that would be an important signal of deterrence to China.
General, it is the third year of the war, and Ukrainian army has been fighting for a long time. There are heavy battles. We're tired. And do you think that if Ukraine will receive a huge amount of weapons next year, or at the beginning of the next year, it will seriously change the situation on the battlefield, and it will affect for our possibility to defeat the Russia?
So, Great Britain was at war for over 5 years, a global war, fighting in Europe and in the Pacific and in Africa. They suffered enormously. And the first 3 years, there was only bad news for them. And so I know Ukrainian people are as tough and determined to defend their country and their families as were the British. So I would offer that for historical comparison. There is no one weapon that would change everything, but if you provided a lot of those weapons or capabilities, long-range precision capability, which would enable Ukraine to strike the bases from which Russian air and missile attacks are originating, that would enable Ukraine to destroy Russian headquarters, to destroy Russian logistics. That would make a difference. But I mean, it would have to be huge quantities, not just 10 or 20 or 50, big numbers. So that could make the difference. But you raise the important point of manpower. I think that Ukraine has enough people, they just don't have enough soldiers. And this is the duty of the government, not the army, but the government, to earn the confidence of Ukrainian families that their son or daughter would not be wasted, that they will not be put into combat until they are properly trained, have the right equipment, and are put into a unit that is properly trained. Then I think more families would have confidence in the government. I hear reports all the time that there are thousands of Ukrainian men, especially, but also women who are military age that are there in Ukraine that could go. But for different reasons, they're not there. And of course, it's well known that there are tens of thousands of military age women and men that are in Germany and Poland, Romania, other places, even in Canada, where I just came from this weekend, that should be home in Ukraine joining the army. So this This is the job of the government to and other influencers in Ukraine to encourage women and men to join, but the pressure has to be on the government to earn the confidence of their families. That this is not the old prison army from Soviet times, but it is a modern army that values every single life of their soldiers.
Are you expecting that Ukraine could receive many modern weapons next year, if not?
I'm not expecting it, but I'm advocating for it. The European countries recognize that if the new U.S. administration under President Trump does not continue the support for Ukraine, Europe knows they will have to fill that gap, because if Ukraine fails, there will be an enormous price to pay by Europe, with millions more Ukrainian refugees, continued disruption of food and energy supplies, loss of credibility. So I think that the European countries will have to step up, and I'm encouraged by the election of the new defense commissioner of the European Union, Mr. Kubilius, the former prime minister of Lithuania, and the new high representative for international affairs and security, former Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas. These are two very good people. They are not confused about the threat from Russia, and I expect that they will do a lot to help improve Europe's ability to provide weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. The U.S., though, is who really, but Germany and UK and France also have to increase what we're doing. But this, what's provided, that's a policy decision. But the policy decision should come from an objective, which is we want Ukraine to win. That's the key, is to get the president of the United States to say it's our strategic objective that Ukraine defeats Russia because it's in our interest. This is not charity for Ukraine.
General, let's look for the European countries. They increasing their defense spending, improve their military logistics, and they declare in preparation for the big war with Russia, not just to help for Ukraine, but they try to be ready for the war with Russia. How this tendency will continue in the next year, and how it will depend on the situation on the Ukrainian battlefields. For example, we will have ceasefire, or we will have a stop of the war, or war in Ukraine will continue, and how all the situation will depend from position of Donald Trump.
Well, it seems to me that most European leaders have finally awakened to who and what Russia is. There are some factions, obviously, inside Germany and inside some other countries, Slovakia, Hungary, a couple of others, that are either sympathetic or do not want to get involved against Russia, or they're sympathetic to Russia for whatever reasons. But the majority of countries seem increasingly willing to do more. We've seen that in the last few weeks. And I spoke with a German officer yesterday who was very confident, he was very clear that they are working towards preparations for when they think Russia might be prepared to attack NATO. So, I mean, this is not a debate anymore about if it will happen, if Ukraine fails. And so clearly the best thing for Western Europe would be to help Ukraine defeat Russia in Ukraine versus having to do it later in Poland, in the Baltics, in Romania. From an American perspective and a Canadian perspective, of course, there is this has always been the case, at least for the last several years, a long-term concern about China. But the best way to prevent a war with China is for China to see that we are prepared and that we have the political will and the industrial capacity and the military capability and the allies to defeat them. And you do that by helping Ukraine defeat Russia. So this is an important symbol of deterrence. And, before the election, I was very concerned about what a Trump administration might mean for Ukraine. But to be honest, since the election a month ago, I have heard a lot less negative anti-Ukraine language coming from some of the people around Mr. Trump. I'm not saying he's all of a sudden pro-Ukraine, but I'm just saying I don't hear the same amount of negative talk. I look at who he has picked as his national security advisor, Mr. Waltz, who is pro-Ukraine, very hawkish on Russia. The person he just picked to be his envoy, General Kellogg, very pro-Ukraine, said that Russia cannot be trusted. This is a good mindset for somebody that's going to be the envoy. Most of the leadership, the Republican leadership in the House of Representatives and the Senate are pro-Ukrainian and pro-NATO. And I thought it was good that Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, went to see Mr. Trump already and impressed on him how important it was that we support Ukraine and that the U.S. not turn its back on Europe. And also, I think he probably reminded Mr. Trump that if Ukraine failed during the Trump administration, that Trump would be seen as the loser, which, of course, he does not want. So we'll see. But I'm a little bit more hopeful that the Trump administration will realize that they have huge leverage, that Putin is not the same guy from 8 years ago, that he has been exposed, he's isolated. Russia's economy is doing terrible. They have a catastrophe in Ukraine. They're losing in Syria. They're losing in Georgia. Here's a chance that Trump comes in with enormous leverage, and he can, he could say to the Russians, if you don't leave, I'm going to give Ukraine everything they need. I mean, he's coming in at a different level than where Biden was 3 years ago. So I hope he will use this opportunity.
As for the Kellogg, he is not diplomat, he is a general. General Hodges, it seems to me that generals, I think so, have a little bit another understanding of negotiation or process of negotiation than diplomats. Am I right? And do you think that this factor will influence for the process of negotiations?
Of course, General Kellogg has been retired for almost 20 years, and he's worked in government for quite some time. Worked in the last Trump administration for 4 years with national security staff and the vice president. So he won't be it's not like he's coming out of the trenches going right to being an envoy. But I do think that military normally speak a little bit more directly, that are more clear, and understand how to use force when it's appropriate and what's required. And so I hope that he is able to convey to the Russians as well as Ukraine that Ukrainian sovereignty is essential, that Russia cannot be trusted, and that the United States is prepared to do everything necessary to help Ukraine win. That's what I hope. Now, of course, Mr. Kellogg will be the envoy. The policy will come from the White House. So that's, regardless of what Mr. Kellogg says, the key will be what policy does he have to deliver. And I hope it's a policy that's not only best for Ukraine, but it's also best for the West, which is defeat Russia first.
General, do you believe that the ceasefire or the stop of the war is possible next year? Do you think that Russia is ready for the negotiations?
I think that Russia is not ready yet because they still believe that they can win. I mean, I think they're waiting to see if the West will stick with Ukraine. So right now, I would say no. And I would also say that, of course, nobody in the world believes that they would live up to any agreement. They never have, unless there is a force in place to make them do it. So, ceasefire, those things always sound good, but they don't work. I mean, we've been through that before. During the Minsk process, there were ceasefires, and Russia violated those, almost on a daily basis. So we should not be naive about that. And I think that, of course, it's up to the Ukrainian people on what they're willing to accept. But I think most Ukrainians know that if any land is given over to Russia as a result of negotiation, or the Russians are allowed to keep what they have already taken illegally, that's a death sentence for Ukrainians that live there. There's no place in history that got better after Russia occupied it. Nowhere. And so I think that this is going to be a grim reality for Ukraine. That if you negotiate, what I like what your president has said. Yeah, negotiate if they have NATO membership, and for all of Ukraine, and that they'll get the territory back through diplomatic means later. I think that's clear. He's making it clear that NATO membership, but even still, any sort of ceding of land to Russia that somehow, okay, you can keep this for now, you'll have to fight to get it back.
General, I think everybody understands that ceasefire or the end of the war is not just about the Ukraine. Because, as you say, China is looking what will happen. Do you think that the results of the war in Ukraine will influence for the balance of power in different parts of the world?
Absolutely. This is very important. This war is not about just Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is doing all the fighting, but the war itself is about whether or not the West actually believes in and is willing to defend sovereignty, human rights, international law, freedom of navigation. Are we willing to do what's required to protect those things? Otherwise, I don't want to hear anybody ever tell me never again, like they did after World War II, if you're not willing to stop Russia now. And to me, it's so obvious what needs to be done that Ukraine has basically by itself stopped Russia with some material help from other countries. But it's been the will of the Ukrainian people, the tenacity of Ukrainian soldiers. And I mean, this is a bargain for the West to just provide the tools for Ukraine. Ukraine's not asking for a single soldier. So to me, this is so obvious. And the war would have been over last year if we had made that decision last year. We've got to stop worrying about Russia might use a nuclear weapon, because they're not.
General, and last question, if it is possible, the leaders of Great Britain and France discussed the possibility of presence their soldiers in Ukraine. Do you think that this is a real scenario?
That would be a decision for UK and France. I'm not against it, but anytime you put soldiers somewhere, I want to know what the mission is. What is their purpose? It's one thing to just put we've made that mistake for years. We just send soldiers in different places without having a clear end state. And so I would really want to hear, if I was the chief of British forces or French forces, I would want to know exactly what is my mission? What is the end state I'm supposed to achieve that makes it worth risking the lives of these soldiers? What do we prepare for? And who do they work for? What's the chain of command? That has to be very clear. And also, what are the rules of engagement? What can they do, in the situation? Are they going there to fight? And of course, they will need air power, They need to be able to shoot down drones, and they need all of these things. This is not like sending palace guards somewhere. This is real, and for them to be credible, they have to be there, ready to fight.
General, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you.
It was my privilege as always, and I really like your Christmas tree there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and best wishes for the new year and Merry Christmas.
It's going to be better.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.